Hey hipsters, it's Blake, the Highlander hipster, back again bringing you another deck tech filled with unhinged ramblings. If you like that and enjoy your time here, don't forget to do the algorithm stuff. Let's talk about what we're building around today. Today we're going to build a new deck around a new commander called Wayta Trainer Prodigy. She's red, green, and a white for a human warrior. She's a 1/5 with haste. And you can pay 2 and a green and tap her. Target creature you control fights another creature. This ability costs 2 less to activate if it targets 2 creatures you control, and if a creature you control being dealt damage causes a triggered ability. If a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So it's kind of like a pain harmonicon. Your creature's taking damage, you get extra abilities. That's awesome. And it also kind of incentivizes you for making your creatures fight each other by making its fight ability much, much cheaper. What I've decided to go with for today's build is more leaning heavily into the second strategy and trying to use it as a win condition, a value generation source, all sorts of things. This is definitely a deck that will scale with time. The more and more effects that we get that work with this last ability, the better this deck is going to get, because Wayta does the work for you as far as the facilitating of being the dealing the damage. So that being said, let's get into what we have decided to build around. What our main goal is, as probably from the title, is building around cards like Stuffy Doll and Brash Taunter. These are creatures that allow you to burn your opponent's life totals by dealing damage to them. So we'll read the two of them. They essentially do the same thing. They're both 5-mana indestructible creatures. When they get dealt damage, you can deal the amount of damage dealt to them to target opponent. In Stuffy Doll's case, it can only deal it to one particular player that you choose when it enters, and you can tap to deal 1 damage to itself. And in Brash Taunter's case, you can pay 3 mana and tap it to have it fight another creature, so it scales a lot better and can fight anything, not die, and deal a lot of damage. Now with Wayta out, obviously you can facilitate these a lot better. These deal double damage, and you don't have to use their own abilities to make them fight. You can use Wayta's much cheaper ability as long as you have another creature worth fighting. So there's a lot of effects like these Stuffy Doll effects. But Brash Taunter and Stuffy Doll are probably the best 2 at it. They're pretty heavy in mana, being 5 mana, but they're indestructible, so they'll live through any heavy damage that you put on them, whether blocking or fighting or whatever. So yeah, this is going to be our main win condition of the deck, and we're going to move into a little bit more redundancy besides just these 2. We have a handful of other ones as well. Boros Reckoner, another pretty famous one. It's red-white hybrid 3 times. 3/3 Minotaur Wizard. Whenever it's dealt damage, you deal that much damage to any target. So in Boros Reckoner's case, you can actually kill creatures with it too, which is kind of nice, but usually you'll go face with it. And you can also give it first strike, which is pretty irrelevant. And a new one, Donna Noble. She's 3 and a red for a human. She's a 2/4 with Soul Bond. And whenever her or a creature that's paired with her is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to target opponent. So she can turn other things into Stuffy Dolls while also being a Stuffy Doll herself. Pretty great. It also allows your Stuffy Dolls to quadruple up with Wayta out on the battlefield, which is really nice because it'll stack the damage effects and everything too. So yeah, these are 2 classic standbys. Donna's a pretty new one, but a very impressive one that works really great with our deck. Another older one, Spite Mare. It's 2 and a red-white hybrid and a red-white hybrid, so 4 mana for a 3/3. When it's dealt damage, it deals that much damage to target creature or player. Nowadays, this just says any target, so it's just like Boros Reckoner, but it's 1 more mana, but it's a little easier to cast. And then also we have Wrathful Raptors, another new one. It's 4 and a red for a 5/5 dinosaur with trample. When a dinosaur you control is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any target that isn't a dinosaur. There's a few other dinosaurs in this deck, but this is definitely not like an enraged deck like you might see other Wayta decks being built. I don't feel like that's a very strong strategy. I'm not a big tribal player in general, but I think it's a little bit too of a mana-intensive deck with a bunch of disparate parts. A lot of the different enraged creatures do a lot of different things. But we decided to take the really good ones that give us value that we need for our deck to function. But we'll get into that later. But essentially, this is just a bigger Stuffy Doll that can tangle in combat a little bit better. And since we have a few extra dinosaurs here and there, it gives us a little extra synergy every once in a while as well. We also have Fiend Lash and Blazing Sunsteel. These are equipment that actually turn things into Stuffy Dolls. And Fiend Lash's case is 1 and a red with equip for 2 and a red. And it gives the equipped creature +2/+0 in reach. That's good. Gives us a little reach protection. And whenever equipped creature is dealt damage, it deals damage equal to its power to any target player or planeswalker. So this is much better to put on the bigger stuffy dolls. But it also bumps the power, so it gives you much better damage sourcing. And then Blazing Sunsteel is 1 and a red and 4 to equip. Equipped creature gets +1/+0 for each opponent you have, so it's essentially going to give +3 power. And whenever equipped creatures dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any target. So this is the exact Stuffy Doll text. And this one will also double up if you actually put it on Stuffy Dolls and such too. So yeah, these are very nice. They allow Wayta to actually get the Stuffy Doll ability, which is very useful since she has a lot of toughness. Or it can double up on your Stuffy Dolls if you got one out. Now, a newer card that people may not want to play just because Day and Night is so annoying, but Ill-Tempered Loner nonetheless is very good for our deck. It's 2 red for a human werewolf. It's a 3/3. When it's dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any target. We've already talked about why that's good. 1 in a red, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. Not that relevant. But its Nightbound side is pretty insane if you ever get to flip it. The Nightbound side is a 4/4. Whenever a permanent you control is dealt damage, Howlpack Avenger, deals that much damage to any target. So any of your permanents getting dealt damage will do the damage. So it turns everything into Stuffy Dolls, including itself. And it also still retains the 1 in a red to pump its power ability. So yeah, Ill-Tempered Loner we're pretty happy with already. As you can see, we're running Spite Mare, which is essentially this card. But if you ever get to flip to the backside, you will absolutely nuke some people, which is pretty hilarious. But yeah, Daybound, Nightbound, people get annoyed by it and all that sort of stuff. That's another topic. And then I got one more fun one in here. This is Saving Grace. It's 1 and a white for an aura. It has flash, and you enchant creatures you control. Whenever it enters the battlefield, all damage that will be dealt to this turn to you and permanents you control is dealt to enchanted creature instead. And it also gives the enchanted creature +0/+3. This is pretty hilarious to put onto a Boros Reckoner if somebody's trying to Alpha Strike you or play a big old Blasphemous Act or something. One of your creatures gets to soak up all that damage and absolutely nuke an opponent out of existence. So this card's a fun one. You can definitely get blown out with this one. So I didn't. There's another effect that's very similar to this, but I decided to try this one as a little fun include. So far I haven't got to play this card yet, but I'm pretty excited for it nonetheless. If you like to be tricksy, then you'll definitely like that card. So let's move into some ways to deal a lot of damage to our creatures if our opponents aren't playing big creatures or helping us out, really. First up, we have the aforementioned Blasphemous Act. Pretty ubiquitous card in the format. It's 8 and a red, and it costs 1 less for each creature on the battlefield and deals 13 damage to each creature. You know what it does. It's one of the best board wipes in the format. But dealing 13 damage to our Stuffy Dolls and such, especially when those triggers happen twice, it's going to absolutely nuke some people. And Star of Extinction is very similar. It's 5 red for a sorcery. You destroy target land, and then this deals 20 damage to each creature and each planeswalker. These are very satisfying and reliable kill conditions for us to burn out our opponents and also clear the board if things are getting a little too congested. But most likely, if there's more creatures on the board, that's probably better for us. More options to fight. Also, we have Chain Reaction. 2 red for a sorcery. It deals X damage to each creature, where X is the number of creatures on the battlefield. So this will generally deal close to 10 plus damage, as we're a pretty creature-heavy deck, as we'll get into later. So yeah, another reliable version of the damage. And also, this card is pretty terrible in basically every situation, but I've actually found it to be quite good in this deck. It's called Boxing Ring. May have forgotten about this card from New Capenna Commander, which nobody ever remembers any of the cards from that set. But it's 1 and a green for an artifact. And it says, whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it fights up to 1 target creature you don't control with the same mana value. And you can tap it to create a treasure token, activate only if you control a creature that fought this turn. This card's pretty great. It allows us to get our mana back from Wayta fights with the treasures. And also, if we get into a position where we're playing Stuffy Dolls out and our opponents have something that we can reliably fight to force some damage immediately with no use of mana, then that's great. And so far, I've been very impressed with this card in the deck. It does everything you kind of want to do. And it's kind of fun to play cards that no other decks play, too. So, Boxing Ring is a really fun one for this deck. And now let's get into some of the glue that holds our deck together. These are other damage-dealing enablers that will get doubled that do things that our deck really needs to, be a real deck. First up, we have Ripjaw Raptor, which is 2 green for a dinosaur. It's a 4/5, and when it's dealt damage, you draw a card. This will double with Wayta. We definitely desperately need card draw in this deck, as we're a creature-based deck, so when we cast our board wipes and stuff, we're going to be down some cards, so we lean really heavily into creatures. So we really need all the ways that we can to retain cards, especially cards that draw cards that synergize with our commander, which at current is a little bit few and far between. But we do have another one in Feldon, Ronom Excavator. It's 1 and a red for a 2/2 with haste. It can't block, and when it's dealt damage, exile that many cards from the top of your library. Choose one of them until the end of your next turn. You may play that card. So this gives us a lot of card selection from our deck, and we have a lot of redundancy, so we don't really have to have one specific card from our deck. So if we accidentally exile something that we aren't able to cast, that a lot of decks might struggle with if they lost like a particular combo piece or whatever, we have a lot of redundancy in the effects that we have, so it's not going to hurt us too bad. But it gives us a lot of card selection, especially if we cast like a Blasphemous Act and then its trigger get doubles and so on. So Feldon, a very essential piece to the deck. Flumph, in a similar vein to Ripjaw Raptor and Feldon Excavator, is 1 and a white for a 0/4 with Defender and Flying. And when it's dealt damage, you and target opponent each draw a card. Generally, you're going to want to split this up. You'll draw 2, and then you'll make one opponent draw 1 and another opponent draw 1. You can probably work out some political favors with this, but we desperately need the card draw, like I said. So Flumph is a good, reliable source. It's not going to die to our own fights, and just keep the cards flowing. Metropolis Reformer is 2 and a white for a 2/3 Angel Cleric with Flying Vigilance. You have Hexproof, and when it's dealt damage, you gain that much life. Since we'll get into it later, but we have a few creature tutors, and this is something that we might need if we start getting beat down and we're not being able to effectively block or deal damage to our opponents that are threatening us. This is a good way to get out from under those threats and kind of gain a bunch of life back that we might need necessary. But this is really the only slot that I've dedicated to gaining life. But it's nice to have that little utility piece in the deck, especially since it gets doubled with our commander. Next up, we have Ranging Raptors and Needletooth Raptor. Ranging Raptors is 2 and a red for a dinosaur. It's a 2/3. When it's dealt damage, you may search your library for a basic land, put it on the battlefield tapped. This is very strong with our commander. We're going to very quickly get all the basics out of our deck with this card. Doubling basics every time we fight? Yes, please. This is going to ramp us to insane levels, which we really do need, so we can keep playing creatures and drawing cards from the effects that we can. And the next up is another role player, Needletooth Raptor. It's 3 and a red for a 2/2 dinosaur. When it's dealt damage, it deals 5 damage to target creature an opponent controls. Sometimes with the fights that we have, we're not able to effectively kill off our opponent's creatures, especially like their utility creatures that may be sitting around that are like 3/3s or 4/4s or whatever, that are just really getting on our nerves. So that's where Needletooth Raptor comes in. It can clean up some of the crap lying around that's being annoying to us. Just a good role player. We need some removal, and it's nice when we can get that double effect with our commander as well. And like I said, we got a few enraged dinosaurs like those in the deck to work, but we're definitely not built around dinosaurs. So next up, we're going to move into the section where it's kind of built around really just rounding out the deck and just giving it more things for consistency. Like I said, we're a creature-based deck, and we need all the card draw we can get from our creatures. So that's where we have Beast Whisper and Guardian Project here. You probably don't need me to read these, but I'll go ahead and run them off real quick anyway. Beast Whisper is 2 green for a 2/3 Elf Druid. Whenever you cast a creature spell, you draw a card. And Guardian Project's an enchantment for 3 and a green. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it doesn't have the same name as another creature you control or a creature in your graveyard, draw a card. This is singleton, so it's always basically going to always draw us a card. So yeah, we're a creature-based deck. We want to draw cards off of our stuffy dolls and our other utility creatures that we mentioned before and that we're about to mention more of. So we desperately need these cards. Usually your creature tutors or whatever are going to get Beast Whisperer first, or Ripjaw Raptor, whatever sort of situation you're in. So make sure if you're playing this deck that you keep that in mind, that you really need to keep your card draw engines online. Similarly, we have Naeth of the Dire Hunt, 2 green for a 3/3 human warrior. Whenever one or more creatures you control fight or become blocked, you draw a card. Beginning of combat on your turn, you can pay 3 mana if you do double target creature's power until end of turn, and it must be blocked if able this turn. This is once again just for consistency. We have a few ways that we'll get to soon where we can make this fight thing happen more than once a turn as well. So yeah, this is just much needed consistent card draw. Hans Eriksson is a pretty fun one. He's 2 red and a green for a 1/4 human scout. Whenever he attacks, you reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature card, which it is often will be, put it on the battlefield tapped an attacking defending player or a planeswalker they control. Otherwise, put that card into your hand. When you put a creature into the battlefield this way, it fights Hans Eriksson. Works with Nath pretty well, but more importantly, it helps us cheat out our stuffy dolls and such, and they generally won't die or kill Hans Eriksson. So that's really nice. And at the very least, it'll just draw us lands and other things that we need. So these aren't the most impressive sort of cards. I think of them more as like Phyrexian arenas. They're just going to give us good, consistent card draw that our deck needs. And they're creatures, so they work with all of our other creature synergies. Next up, we have Tocacious Welcome. It's 2 and a white for an enchantment. Whenever one or more creatures with mana value 3 or less enter the battlefield under your control, draw a card. This ability triggers once a turn. This works really good in token strategies especially, but we have a lot of mana dorks, and a few of our stuffy dolls enter and draw some cards. We have lots of small creatures that will trigger this. Once again, I look at this kind of more of a Phyrexian arena effect, and same thing with Welcoming Vampire. It's 2 and a white for a vampire. It's a 2/3 with flying. Whenever one or more creatures with power 2 or less enter the battlefield under your control, draw a card. This ability only triggers once a turn. More of our creatures have 2 power or less than not, so most of our creatures will trigger this. Once again, giving us a little bit of consistency in our card draw and our game plan. Dawn of a New Age also falls under this category. It's 1 and a white for an enchantment. It enters the battlefield with a hope counter on it for each creature you control. At the beginning of your end step, you remove a hope counter from it, draw a card, and then if it has no hope counters on it, you sacrifice it and gain 4 life. Pretty self-explanatory, just a consistent card draw. We generally commit to the board a bit, so this will usually enter with at least a few counters on it. Sylvan Library, 1 and a green, enchantment. At the beginning of your draw step, you may draw 2 additional cards. If you do, choose 2 cards in your hand drawn this way. For each of those cards, you pay 4 life or put it back on top of your library. Sylvan Library is just a good standby card draw source. It's very cheap. Unfortunately, these aren't creatures, these 2 in particular, but they'll give us consistent card draw, which we will desperately need. And then lastly, we have Elven Chorus. It's 3 and a green for an enchantment. You may look at the top card of your library anytime. You may cast creature spells from the top of your library, and then creatures you control can tap to add 1 mana of any color. So yeah, it's kind of like a future sight for our deck. Allows us to get more consistent card draw, play creatures off the top, do all that good stuff. Been interested in trying this card out. This card is one of the ones in this section that I could see cutting if it doesn't perform as well. But definitely one that I'm at least willing to try out, as over a third of our deck is creatures. So let's move into the section of creatures that kind of fill out our deck. We're going to start with some mana dorks here. Mana dorks are typically pretty underrated in Commander, I would say. They allow us to get off the ground a lot sooner, and they work with a lot of the synergies, as we've mentioned just in the prior section. So they work very well in our deck and will allow for consistency. Absence Pilgrim's the first one. It's 1 green mana for a 1/1 and it taps for a white. Birds of Paradise is 1 green mana for a 0/1 flyer that adds for 1 mana of any color. Pretty self-explanatory. Everybody knows those cards. Good old reliable mana dorks. Elvish Mystic and Llanowelves, they're the same card. They're green mana and tap for a green. 1/1s. No frills there. We also have Fendhorn Elves, which is the same card as previous. Sakura Tribe Elder. Everybody knows Steve. I'm not going to waste your time reading those either. Wood Elves. Farhaven Elf. You know, they're great. They work with our deck. They synergize with all the things. Good stuff. Spring Bloom Druid. I'll go ahead and read this one. Maybe some people aren't as familiar with this one. It's 2 and a green for a 1/1. When it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice a land. If you do, search your library for 2 basic lands. Put them on the battlefield tapped. I look at this just like a Farhaven Elf for our deck. We're not really using lands in our graveyard or the land synergy in general, but it's just 3 mana. Creature puts us up a land. That's great. That's what we want. We have 3 other ramp cards for the deck that aren't creatures, but I just found that they're just efficient enough that I wanted to run them. It's Nature's Lore and 3 visits to Stardust. You know what they do. They get you a forest untapped for 2 mana. That's pretty insane for ramp. They're the only cards that do this, so they seem a little too good to pass up. But there's a world where I could live in where maybe those are cuttable for like mana dorks. And then lastly, we have Soul Ring. Yeah, you play Soul Ring in your Commander decks. It's good. Alrighty, so let's kind of round out the deck in this last section. This is kind of the best of the rest section, I would say. This is just like good synergy cards for our deck that facilitate what our commander wants to do and what our deck themes want to do that maybe aren't just like card draw and ramp and stuff. So first up, we have Seedborn Muse. I'm sure you know this one. It's 3 green for a 2/4 spirit. It untaps all permanents during each other player's untap step, which is really great for Wayta, as she can keep the fighting going every single turn. So yeah, it can get out of hand pretty quick with this on the battlefield, is when you start actually having enough mana and resources to keep fighting your opponent's stuff constantly. So Seedborn Muse is pretty nuts in this deck, as it is a lot of decks. Drum Bellower is very similar. It's 2 and a white for a 2/1 flyer, and it untaps all creatures you control during each other player's untap step. So this is another good reason to have Mana Dorks in our deck, because they'll be the ones that'll also keep untapping and allow us to keep activating Wayta on everybody else's turn as well. In a similar vein, we have White Plume Adventure. If you've played older formats, then I'm sure you're having initiative flashbacks, PTSD. But yeah, White Plume Adventure is 2 and a white for a 3/3. When it enters the battlefield, you take the initiative. And at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, untap a creature you control. If you've completed a dungeon, untap all creatures you control instead. If you don't know, the initiative is very powerful. I'm not going to show you the initiative here, but one of the important modes is the very first time you enter the dungeon for the initiative, you get a basic land. So this essentially draws you a card when it enters as well, which is really nice. And untapping a creature during each of your opponent's turns is really, really good, as it allows us to get our Wayta more activated more consistently. So yeah, White Plume Adventure, kind of a smaller brother to the other 2 previously mentioned cards, but nonetheless, still very powerful. Alright, some glue cards to hold the deck together. We need some interaction, and it's better if we put it on creatures so it'll work with the rest of our deck. Reclamation Sage, Knight of Autumn, you know what they do. They're really good. They destroy artifacts and enchantments when they enter, and they'll work with all of our other draw card source synergies that we went over earlier. Skyclave Aberration, in a similar vein, has a little bit more flexibility than the other 2. Allows us to get rid of other things besides just artifacts and enchantments. Skyclave Aberration, just an all-star in most white decks, I would say. Try this card out if you haven't. It's 1 white for a core spirit. It's a 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, you exile up to 1 target non-land, non-token permanent you don't control with mana value 4 or less. A lot of words there, but it blows up most small things. Gets rid of them for good. Because when it leaves the battlefield, the exiled card's owner creates an XX blue illusion creature token, where X is the converted mana cost of the exiled card. So the card you got rid of is just exiled forever. They just get some stupid vanilla creature in its place. So very powerful card. If you haven't played with Skyclave Apparition, like I said, definitely do it. We also have Eternal Witness for some good recursion. I'm not going to read that one. It's a great card. You know what it does. Works with all our synergies. Next up, we have Selfless Spirit. It's 1 and a white for a 2/1 flyer. It's a Spirit Cleric. You can sacrifice it to give creatures you control indestructible until end of turn. Very useful for our Mana Dorks and our utility creatures and our Reckoners that aren't indestructible, so we can kind of freely cast like Blasphemous Axe and Doom and stuff and not have to worry about having to rebuild quite as much if we can't quite kill everybody at once with it. So yeah, and it's also a creature, so works with all the synergies that we've mentioned before, like I keep saying. And then next we have Rocco Cabaretti Caterer. He's X red, white, green for a 3/1. When he enters the battlefield, if you cast it, you may search your library for a creature card with mana value X or less and put it onto the battlefield and then shuffle. Good old creature tutor that's on a creature. Very useful for us. We can get Brash Taunters, we can get Beast Whisperers, we can get, Mana Dorks, we can get Ripjaw Raptors, Ranging Raptors, all sorts of great stuff Rocco has to grab. So, very good card. And that kind of leads us into our next section, which we're going to keep talking about some more tutors, some creature-based tutors that are very good for our deck. For the same reasons I just mentioned with Rocco, they get a lot of the very important pieces in our deck. Eldamri's Call is 1 and a green for an instant. You search your library for a creature, put it in your hand. That's great. It's a really good rate. Instant speed is also very nice. Invasion of Ikoria. I know it's kind of hard to read because I got it vertical here, but it's green X. You search your library and or graveyard for a non-human creature card with mana value X or less and put it onto the battlefield. And then it flips into some random 8/8 that doesn't matter. But yeah, it's just a good old creature tutor. It works very similarly to the next card that we're going to mention, which is Finale of Devastation. It's X green. Basically does the same thing, but if you pay X 10 or more, you can pump your creatures to give them haste. Not really too worried about that in this deck like most other decks are. But it's just another good, reliable utility, sort of toolboxy tutor. Eldritch Evolution is 1 green for sorcery. As an additional cost to cast it, you have to sack a creature, but you get a 2 to your library for a converted mana cost X or less creature, where X is the creature's mana cost plus 2, and you put it into play, then you exile the spell. So this allows us to kind of jump up a little bit faster in our tutoring, but it makes us have the cost of sacrificing a creature. As we've laid out, we have a lot of creatures, and some of them are fairly disposable. Throwing away a mana dork is not like the biggest deal in the world. And it also will allow us to kind of get like our Beast Whisperers or our Brash Taunters online a lot sooner. So definitely a good role player, even though we have to kind of go down a card on the exchange. Next up, we have a few more board protection spells, kind of like Selfless Spirit. Heroic Intervention, it's a classic, you know what it does. It does all the same good things that Selfless Spirit does. Boros Charm, kind of a very similar card. Permanents you control gain indestructible is the mode that we care about for red and a white. But the other modes are nothing, I guess. But yeah, just some good, cheap, reliable, protect all of our stuff. And I decided to run 2 cards that are kind of like a little bit lower cost, but just protect one thing. Sometimes it's good to have these hyper efficient protection spells, especially when you're trying to make 2 of your creatures fight each other, because you can kind of get blown out if they blow up one of your creatures, or your Wayta if you're trying to make the creature fight Wayta, because then you gotta replay Wayta, rebuild everything, and do all that. So I figured it was worth trying these out, and I've been pretty impressed with them so far. Royal Treatment is the first one. It's a 1 green mana instant. Target creature you control gains hexproof until end of turn, and then you create a Royal token attached to that creature, which is an enchantment aura that gives the creature +1/+1 and ward 1. So this kind of gives it a little bit of a lasting protection too. Ward 1's not obviously insane, but it's at least annoying for your opponents to try to target your thing again. So yeah, hexproof is the important one, but Tameo's Safekeeping, the next one, is 1 green mana for an instant, and it gives target permanent you control hexproof and indestructible till end of turn, and you gain 2 life. Kind of similarly, these are mostly to protect against single target removal, so hexproof is the version that we really care about, but Tameo's Safekeeping is definitely the better one with the indestructible. But I've been pretty happy with both of them. Next up, we have a little bit of Recursion, similar to Internal Witness. Cosmic Rebirth is 1 green and a white for an instant. You choose target permanent card in your graveyard. If it has mana value 3 or less, you put it onto the battlefield. If you don't put it on the battlefield, you put it into your hand, and then you gain 3 life. This is a very good role player. Can bring back lands, bring back utility creatures, bring back our commander if we want to let it go to the graveyard. So Cosmic Rebirth, really good role player for the deck, I would say. Savine's Reclamation is essentially the same card, just on a sorcery, but it also gives you the option to flash it back for 4 and a white, but when you flash it back, you also get an extra copy of it. So, same thing that Cosmic Rebirth's good for, but this gives us even more recursion. If you know me, I'm your local Savine's Reclamation salesman. It's really hard for me not to put it in every single white deck that I play, but it's a great card. And lastly, we have a few fight spells here to kind of round out our consistency in case our Wayta kind of gets stranded from like an oubliette sort of effect or whatever. Colony Ambush is a modal DFC. It's a land on the back, but on the front side, it's 2 and a green for an instant. Target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. I love modal DFCs, so I had to get one in here. And then we also have Tail Swipe. It's 1 green mana for an instant. Choose target creature you don't control and target creature. Choose target creature you control and target creature you don't control. If you cast the spell during your main phase, the creature gets +1/+1, and then those creatures fight. Just a 1 mana instant fight spell. They don't really make these very often, so this is very useful, very good. The +1/+1 during your main phase thing's not really that relevant. Just the 1 green mana instant fight is hard to come by. So yeah, these are just to kind of round out our consistency in our fighting and facilitating damage without having to, commit to like a Blasphemous Act or whatever. Next, we'll get into the mana base. If you look at my deck list, my mana base is pretty insane. It's basically what I would consider kind of the optimal Naya mana base. But I would say just build it with the best Naya lands that you have. If you're not familiar with where I stand on different fixing lands, there's a video on the channel for that. You can check that out. But I did want to highlight the Canopy lands, like Horizon Canopy and Sunbaked Canyon. These lands are extra useful as we run quite a bit of ramp in the deck. But like I said earlier, the card draw can be a little sparse sometimes. So playing any Horizon lands that you have is very good, and they're also very cheap right now. So I would highly recommend these in particular for the deck. And then outside of that, just run whatever fixing lands you can get your hands on. I didn't find it necessary to have very many utility lands for the deck. So lastly for this video, we're going to get into some kind of honorable mentions, cards that I would consider running that I cut, and some kind of stand-ins here. So there's definitely a few more sort of Boros Reckonery, Stuffy Doll sort of effects that you could run. I have True Fire Captain here as an example. It's red, red, white, white for a 4/3 with Mentor. And whenever it's dealt damage, it deals that much damage to target player. The other ones, besides the versions that I have in this deck, I decided to kind of cut and just run an extra tutor instead. Mostly because I would rather not have to tutor up. You don't really want like a ton of duplicates of Stuffy Doll. 1 or 2 is like more than plenty. And I would just rather be able to use those cards and spend a little bit more mana to get like card draw sources or ramp sources or whatever I need at the time. If you're not really into tutors or whatever, then there's a few more Reckoners out there. You can check the description. I put a few of them in there. The description has the deck list and everything in it. And then we also have a few more sort of 1 mana instance that will protect your creatures. I put Blossoming Defense in here as an example. Remember, like I said, I believe that Hexproof is the more important one, at least for the cheap like one-off instance. So I would recommend that over the Indestructible. Nowadays, Indestructible is just not as good anymore. Lots of exile removal, bounce removal, all sorts of stuff. So Hexproof is definitely the one you want if you find that the little one-off protection spells are your jam and you like them. And then we also have like a few sort of trap cards, is at least what I'm calling them for now. They're cards that definitely can work with Wayta. They do kind of have the like double trigger sort of thing going on, but they just don't work in this particular build that I have. Other Wayta builds can probably take better advantage of them. The one that I have kind of as a stand-in here that you'll see in most Wayta decks is Rite of Passage. It's 2 and a green for an enchantment. Whenever a creature you control is dealt damage, you put a 1/1 counter on it. So normally that would be very good, right? We fight consistently, our creatures take damage, and then they scale up pretty quick. For me, I just find that the mana cost is a bit too clunky, and it doesn't really synergize with a lot of the other stuff we have. Most of our creatures are kind of like ETB value creatures where we get most of what we want from them right off of the bat. Our Brash Taunter scaling up isn't really like good for us. Like, I don't know. It doesn't really like do a whole lot. Like, we just want them to take damage. We don't really care if they get bigger. It doesn't really like increase their damage output or anything. So I've just found this card to just not be that synergistic for this deck in particular. But we're definitely going to get a lot more cards moving forward from Wayta that work with her second ability, like I said at the beginning. So definitely keep your eye out for those. But this one in particular and a few others that I've not included in the deck I think are a little bit trapped. So I kind of wanted to give them a special mention. But that kind of wraps up the video. Overall, I think this is a fun little Naya burn deck that we've put together. Very creature-based, very fun. You can kind of have very swingy, out-of-nowhere wins, which you know that I like. So yeah, if you enjoyed this deck tech, do all the algorithm stuff, and stay tuned for more videos. Take care, everybody. Love y'all.